Et Jacques Chirac, qui vient d'être élu président de la République, 52,2% selon les estimations de la...
Once in power, he had little time to savor victory. The war in Bosnia was raging. Later that month, on the 26th of May, 1995, France's new head of state had to deal with the problem of UN peacekeepers taken hostage by Serb troops. Jacques Chirac had been in power barely 10 days.
I odluke vaših pretpostavljenih starešina
Et les décisions de vos supérieurs
da vas žrtvuju u interesu nekih viših ciljeva
de vous sacrifier dans des intérêts supérieurs
doveli su danas do ove neprijatne situacije.
ont amené jusqu'à cette situation désagréable aujourd'hui.
Chirac, in the Élysée, fumed. Around 100 French hostages were exhibited as spoils of war.
This was really the first major event for him to deal with as a president. The men had been taken hostage and put on show in a humiliating way. It was just impossible to accept that.
Chirac ordered French troops to respond to any attack. Serbian soldiers dressed up as peacekeepers seized a bridge in Sarajevo the following night. French forces moved in hours later. 2 French soldiers were killed during the operation. The battle marked a turning point.
Nos soldats étaient envoyés sur le terrain.
Our soldiers were sent into the field and were at danger, but couldn't fight back. He was aware that if the United Nations flag was not respected, and if resolutions adopted by the Security Council were not enforced, then the UN was discredited. He realized the only way to deal with fighters determined to engage in battle, including against UN soldiers, was to say that if you attack us, we will respond. And that's simply what's called legitimate self-defense.
Chirac proposed the creation of a rapid reaction force, its main goal to ensure the safety of peacekeepers. One was set up after weeks of negotiations and a UN vote. A 4,000-strong force was eventually deployed. The balance of power changed on the ground, and on the 14th of December 1995, the French president hosted the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords in Paris. They had been initialed in Dayton, Ohio in late November after weeks of negotiations led by the American President Bill Clinton. Chirac, at the time, appeared in France and elsewhere as having played a key role.
Well, I thought it was important that we took a much more active role in Bosnia, and so I, in fact, at the time applauded what the French president was doing. You know, I think it indicated that he was prepared to take a more muscular approach to French foreign policy when he thought it right.
And that was pretty much the view in the American press, where Chirac was nicknamed the bulldozer.
Yes, of course. He would come in and kick the table over, meet people on both sides, force the hand of destiny. My mother told me that President Pompidou said that he was a bulldozer, so that description probably reflects his personality.
But this is a completely false picture of him. He's obviously quite capable of getting his own way, especially when it comes to defending France's interests. But he's anything but rude. On the contrary, he's highly cultured. This is what the United States may not have understood.
Chirac's directness was most in evidence in an incident in Jerusalem in October 1996. Held back by security guards, he let rip.
What do you want? Me to go back to my plane and go back to France? Is that what you want? Then let them go. And let them do. No,
Yeah, I like that.
This is not a method. This is a provocation. That is provocation.
It's not a provocation.
Please, you stop now. Bonjour.
Yeah, and one of the things that I did admire about him, even when I disagreed with him, is he had no hesitation in expressing himself. Let's say that's what I mean by saying he had a presidential demeanor about him, and he wouldn't let anyone push him around.
That rant, because it was a rant after all. Well, I thought it was not good form in terms of my idea of what the President of the Republic should be like, not least abroad.
Chirac's feistiness made him a hero in Arab countries. He was greeted in triumph in the Palestinian territories hours later. Chirac sought to build on that over the years to bring the two sides together.
Ce qu'on appelait le processus de paix commence à donner ses premiers signes de faiblesse.
We were at a point where what we call the Middle East peace process was showing the first signs of flagging. And that was when we had to convince Arafat to reach an agreement with the Israelis and convince the Israelis to give way on the questions of borders, territory, settlements, Jerusalem, and so on.
French policy was consistent and coherent. It led to France's voice being heard. It was disputed, and that tension occurred throughout the Chirac presidency.
Yasser Arafat l'appelait Dr Chirac.
Yasser Arafat used to call the president Dr. Chirac because when he felt downhearted, he always turned to him. Having said that, President Chirac told us the problem was that Arafat couldn't bring himself to make an agreement. When you got to the point of saying the agreement is ready, Arafat then always asked for something more.
Chirac, from 1997 onwards, had to share power in France with a socialist government. He retained control of foreign policy, an area traditionally reserved for the head of state. However, the socialist Prime Minister Lionel Jospin wanted to show he also had a say. And in February 2000, he flew to the Middle East. The visit did not go unnoticed.
La France qui condamne les attaques du Hezbollah et de toute façon toutes les attaques terroristes qui peuvent être menées.
Some Palestinians reacted furiously that Hezbollah had been compared to terrorist groups. Jospin was attacked in Ramallah. People threw stones, forcing him to dash back to his car. There was almost no security. Getting to safety took several minutes.
The Élysée took advantage of the incident in the media to score points against Jospin, which in my opinion was unfair.
There was obviously political tension at home, and this was bound to have some effect.
I can tell you that President Chirac would never use something, never use a situation that puts a French Prime Minister in a poor light while abroad for political reasons or for some small personal advantage. Never.
Power sharing proved especially tense when it came to policy towards Africa.
He was a traditionalist as far as Africa was concerned. It was a classic Franco-French approach. And he wasn't, let's say, looking too closely as far as democracy, human rights, coups were concerned. It was more the old-fashioned approach.
Critics decried Chirac's policy as a continuation of France-Afrique, condemning his friendship with certain unsavory African leaders. He stirred controversy, congratulating Gabon's Omar Bongo on his re-election with nearly 80% of the vote, and when he praised the human rights situation in Tunisia.
Le premier des droits de l'homme, c'est de manger, d'être soigné, de recevoir une éducation. De ce point de vue, il faut bien reconnaître que la Tunisie est très en avance.
He was convinced that for fundamental sensitive issues, such as, for example, the question of human rights, it was useless to throw accusations and insults in people's faces.
Il y a dans ces pays d'abord une fierté nationale.
These countries, first of all, have their national pride and a deep desire to be in charge of their own politics. So, to talk about France-Afrique, imagining France is in a position to change a government here or there, seems to me to be a misunderstanding of how things were then and how they are now.
There was real tension between Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin about this. Whenever there was a crisis in Africa, Jospin came to the fore. He was extremely demanding about the wording of statements, relations with governments.
He thought, look, these are people we dealt with for a long time. It's a different culture. We shouldn't try going and imposing our ways on them. He had a very clear view that it's best not to have too much change and upheaval, because otherwise you don't know what comes out of that.
The 11th of September 2001, a first plane crashes into one of the towers of the World Trade Center in New York. Chirac was in Rennes in Brittany attending an agricultural fair.
We got into our cars as soon as the opening ceremony was over. And a journalist, whose name escapes me, he shouted out, and the windows were open, that there had been an accident. Did you see the accident? Do you have a comment on what's happened in New York? But we had no idea. We were hearing it for the first time.
Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin quickly held a meeting at the Élysée Palace. We had no specific information, so we focused on what could have happened and immediately thought of a terrorist act linked to Islamist terrorism. We didn't know more than that.
France and other allies immediately expressed their support for the United States. Chirac made a statement on French television that evening.
Mes chers compatriotes, les attentats qui ont frappé aujourd'hui les États-Unis d'Amérique sont une épouvantable tragédie. Jamais, aucun pays dans le monde n'a été la cible d'attentats terroristes d'une telle ampleur ni d'une telle violence.
A week later, the French president was the first foreign head of state to go to Washington and New York. The trip had been planned before 9/11. George W. Bush maintained the meeting despite the crisis at home.
I think they discussed some very important things at this point. And perhaps it was already then that a fundamental and incontestably different approach could be seen.
His goal with the trip was to say France is with the Americans when America is attacked, that we are allies and we are close. And what better gesture than to fly over ground zero?
The mayor of New York, without saying anything to anyone, said, "Come on, let's get in the helicopter. We'll fly over the destruction, that way you'll see." I remember he came back really affected, aware of the scale of the tragedy.
Chirac, on his return to France, held talks with Tony Blair in the Élysée Palace. The British Prime Minister was visiting European capitals with military intervention in Afghanistan in the offing.
Straight after September the 11th, I spoke obviously to the American president, but also to our key allies. Though I think it would be right in saying that Jacques Chirac was always more hesitant about military action, even in respect of Afghanistan. I mean, there was basically a coalition of support there.
I don't think that it's wrong to err on the side of caution when it comes to deciding on military action.
The US military did not want to be tangled up in an alliance which would require consultation. They wanted a free rein, essentially saying, "Thanks very much, we'll handle this." So there was no need to ask whether we needed to take things further.
France did not sit back and watch. The country held the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council and put Washington's right to respond to a vote. In NATO, Chirac also brought Article 5 of the alliance into play, requiring US allies to provide assistance. The United States, despite a military campaign in Afghanistan a few years earlier and a series of attacks against its interests in the region, was not yet sure of what it would do.
Our nation was horrified, but it's not going to be...
Central Command, under General Zinni, hadn't done any kind of planning for how you would eliminate al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So the kind of military action was not decided for a couple of weeks, but I think everyone knew there would have to be some kind of military response.
But soon, another conflict was looming, this time in Iraq.
At the time of the shift from the Clinton to the Bush administration, I was a minister visiting Washington. It was the spring of 2001. I went back to Paris and told Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin that they were going to pose a serious problem for us, because they were looking for a reason to start a war in Iraq that they had been wanting to start for a very long time. The neoconservatives believed George Bush Sr. had been wrong to confine himself to the liberation of Kuwait and not to go to Baghdad. And Jacques Chirac said, yes, they are a pain in the neck, I know that, but we know them. And I said, yes, they are annoying, and they're going to put us in some difficult situations.
Washington accused Saddam Hussein of possessing weapons of mass destruction. George W. Bush condemned an axis of evil made up of Iran, North Korea, and Iraq. France did not want armed intervention in Iraq, while UN inspectors on the ground were continuing their mission. American neoconservatives were furious about what they saw as collusion between Paris and Baghdad.
Did a 650-page report for the United Nations on the Oil for Food program. France and Russia are the major recipients of special favors from Iraq. So President Chirac can be unhappy with axis of evil, okay. We were unhappy with the feeling that France, which had played such an honorable role in so many other situations, let's be clear about this, which only made it harder to explain why is this one dictator so tenderly cared for by the French government.
The Americans never liked our traditional approach of friends, allies, but not aligned, which defines Chirac's stance really well. They didn't like it at all.
For France and President Chirac, the issue was dealt with once Saddam Hussein respected UN resolutions, while clearly for the Americans and those aligned with them, there was a need to go further. And military intervention was initiated on the basis of a pretext, the chemical weapons thought to be in Iraq, even though a special commission said there weren't any there.
No weapons of mass destruction have ever been found. Despite that, some officials in the Bush administration maintain their argument.
It's a huge country and they're easy to hide. They said he planned, when the sanctions were lifted, to start up his nuclear program, his chemical program, and his biological program, and he had preparations in place. And the sanctions were collapsing in no small part because France was working in the United Nations to make the sanctions collapse.
Then US Secretary of State Colin Powell presented American evidence against Saddam Hussein on the 5th of February 2003.
He did what he could. I mean, by the way, I learned very belatedly, I was astonished. This came from a source that the Germans had in Germany, but the source refused to deal with us directly. So we were taking secondhand from the BND. That's a good way to get tricked.
The BND, Germany's intelligence service, has seriously questioned the credibility of the source for years and had broken off contact with that source.
We weren't convinced by these arguments. Our intelligence services had very little information on any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was clear to us, in view of the situation in the country, that we couldn't talk about al-Qaeda's involvement.
I think the excellent Colin Powell had been taken in. I think he was an honest man, and I think he believed what he said that day. But he was wrong, and it wasn't his fault.
9 days after Colin Powell's speech, the French Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin, addressed the Security Council to present France's argument.
Personne ne peut donc affirmer aujourd'hui que le chemin de la guerre sera plus court que celui des inspections. Et c'est un vieux pays, la France d'un vieux continent comme le mien, l'Europe, qui vous le dit aujourd'hui, qui a connu les guerres, l'occupation, la barbarie, un pays qui n'oublie pas et qui sait tout ce qu'il doit aux combattants de la liberté venus d'Amérique et d'ailleurs.
It was alleged at the outset that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But this wasn't the case, according to the intelligence services. The now famous speech by the French foreign minister highlighted this. And this was when differences about just how well-founded the arguments were for armed intervention began.
Opposition to the war brought Paris and Berlin closer together. The French and German leaders decided to start meeting regularly.
We needed time to get used to each other. We found it was essential for France and Germany to hold similar positions in preparations for European Council meetings. There was a need for the French President and the German Chancellor and their foreign ministers to meet every 6 to 8 weeks.
These meetings were all the more important, given that the relationship between Gerhard Schröder and Jacques Chirac hadn't, as we know, always been easy.
Mutual respect developed very quickly into a cordial and then a friendly relationship.
Divisions within Europe soon emerged for all to see. Leaders in favor of armed intervention in Iraq published an article in the Wall Street Journal. Blair, Barroso, Aznar and Berlusconi openly opposed Paris's stance.
The fact that France was put on trial in the international media without us being informed beforehand was for him proof that a code of good behavior had not been respected within the European family of nations.
I don't really know. I mean, I can't remember this at the length whether we told them or not. But it never led to a breakup of the relationship because there were lots of things that where we were sensible and important that we worked together.
Chirac, Schröder and Putin did not give in. The French president threatened his trump card to use France's veto in the UN Security Council. Even if the United States gained a majority, 9 votes out of 15, no resolution to allow war would pass.
A line was crossed when it was no longer a question of just regime change. From what I know, France and the French president felt the same.
Quelles que soient les circonstances, la France votera non parce qu'elle considère ce soir qu'il n'y a pas lieu de faire une guerre pour atteindre l'objectif que nous nous sommes fixés, c'est-à-dire le désarmement de l'Irak.
Then it came down to a question of exercising a veto in the UN, and that's when it became important.
Anti-French feeling was growing on the other side of the Atlantic. George W. Bush rejected neutrality, saying, "You are either with us or against us." The American administration threatened those not rallying to its cause.
Les Américains, effectivement, identifient un certain
The Americans identified a number of areas where there could be reprisals. They said there would be consequences.
The French establishment remained extremely reluctant to oppose the Americans. It was a really difficult time, with people coming to see him, and with company bosses telling us to do this and to do that. Not even the foreign ministry felt comfortable with our position at the start.
Washington, in March 2003, without explicit UN approval, launched the first bombs on Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Bilateral ties gradually improved after months of tension. Chirac and Bush met for the first time after the start of the war at the G8 summit in France in June 2003. Both stuck to their guns. The atmosphere, though, was calmer.
Ensuite arrive la question iranienne.
Then the Iran issue came up, and as it did so, the Americans found that France was their most dynamic, inventive, and worthwhile ally.
Et le plus intéressant, c'est la France.
And on Iran, just like after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in Lebanon, France and the United States were able to engage in fruitful dialogue.
It was a matter of regret to me that Chirac, after his second term, felt obliged to smooth things over a bit, apologize a little, because the American reaction was so virulent, simplistic, aggressive, anti-French, in a way that was extremely shocking and wrong. I almost regretted that he went too far in that direction, because he was right after all. He was right.
Jacques Chirac then will be remembered, among other things, as the leader who said no to war, even if it meant putting the relationship with one of France's closest allies at stake.
That report from our correspondent Antoine Mariotti, that brings us to the end of this edition of Reporters. We'll be back again next week, though, for another look behind the headlines around the world. Do join us then.